Well, that's a good question. Why I'm here today? I think that I'm here today because um, uh, it's like a continuous set of consequences that the coincidences and consequences of those coincidences that were taking place in my life recently. Um, because I'm in a relation with somebody who is the mother of somebody who is the husband of a Polish woman, and they have they have a child, a baby, and that baby is literally my my partner's granddaughter. So that's the reason why we started to come here to Poland. This is my third time in the last 3 years. And the first time I came, I, I visited the museum, the Poland Museum, and I knew it was a super important museum reflecting the life of the community, Jewish community here in Poland. And I found that there could be a relationship with my father's early life. And actually, the first time I came and I visited, as I said, the museum, I found the place where my father was born. It's a town called Radno, in a very old map, in an ancient map that's displayed here in the museum. So it was the first light of the connection. And after that, when we started to plan another visit to Poland to visit the family, um, again, because of coincidences that are related to my job, I work as a now running a branding agency, and I'm a graphic designer. But at the same time, I teach design, and I find moments in my university life to go and have long trips, depending on the time when my students have exams, and then I don't have to teach every week as I do. So I found that there was a window to come to Poland, and that window is literally now. And only then, when I decided to come, then I realized that the first week of this 3 weeks window is this one, and this one means that tomorrow is my father's birthday, but it's not any birthday. Is it would be my father's Abraham 100th anniversary. So that made a click on my mind, and I think it's not another date in the calendar. I mean, it's a significant thing, and the fact that I'm going to be in Warsaw the same day my father would have been 100 years old made me think that there should be something that I have to do. Then I planned all this thing. My first reaction was I should be in contact with Pauline Museum, because I particularly, as I said in the event, I love museums. I worked for museums in the past. I think that they could either be traditional or super modern, and trying to connect past with future, przeszłość and przeszłość, past and future in Poland, in Polish, and then and I think that this is a super good example of a museum that really connects past with future in a super innovative way. So I said, which would be the best place for my father to be, for my father's memory to be, and I thought that it wasn't for free that I am here the day he would be 100 years old, and then I thought that the best way to celebrate his anniversary would be through donating some elements belong to him, or to his family here in Poland when we was still here before he got to Argentina, and after that, because one of the books that I'm actually giving to the museum is a Iskurbuch, so called in Yiddish would be a book of memories that reflects the story of the Jewish population, the Jewish people in Radno. The Radno is the place where my father was born, the town, the shtetl, but also the way the Radno descendants gathered and organized themselves in Argentina and North America. So my grandpa, Idel Konischer, he was part of the committee who wrote that book, who produced that book, and I think that, again, as he wrote an article related to the story of the Jewish people in Radno and how life was, I thought that it was interesting for the museum to have it. Besides that, my father had written a book some 6 or 7 years before he died. The book was written in 2007. My father died in 2013, and I helped him to do it and to produce it. He wrote it, but I just made some corrections, and I designed the cover of the book. And so we printed some copies, and it was not intended to be marketed. It was just to give to friends and family. So I still have some copies of those of the book, and I found interesting to have the book here in the museum's library. But again, as it's in Spanish, and Spanish is a language which is not necessarily spoken everywhere, I also decided to make a version in English and a version in po polsku, in Polish. So that's other part of the donation. I mean, I'm contributing with the museum archive and elements with some old books, the Radno books, some old liturgical books, Hebrew, Yiddish, some photos, a notebook, my grandfather's passport, the one he used when he came to Argentina. Unfortunately, I don't have other documents from my father Abraham or the rest of my family. But I think that set of different elements is it's something interesting for the museum to have, and for me to feel that this would be the best place for everybody who wants to know about it to have and to be.
So can you tell a bit about? I think I'm aware that's not a small subject probably, but can you tell about the circumstances of emigration of your how I understand your grandfather with your father?
Yes. Yeah. Well, all I can say is based on my memories of what my father told me. My father and also my grandparents. I talked with them. I talked to them when they lived. I did have at some point, but I was super baby, a grandmother, Dobe. I barely remember her, but I do remember my grandparents. By the way, my mother was Uruguayan. She was Jewish as well, and my grandparents from my mother's side, they also came from Poland. So I have Polish in my blood from 4 different sources, you know. But the ones who were more again in relation with descendants gathering where my grandparents from my father's side. And as I said, what I remember from our conversations with my father, with my grandparents, is the fact that they had at some point to look for new horizons. At that point, I'm not 100% sure that this was just because of uh, the forthcoming super horrible years that were about to come in Europe, but they had suffered in pogroms, and they had probably also an idea of a better life in America. America, of course, is a continent that has different places to go. When we say America, living in South America, we refer to America as the whole continent. But probably most of people, when they listen to the word America, they think in North America. Well, at that point, I think that it was an equivalent importance in the way Jewish population from the eastern of Europe would refer to America, because South America was super promising. There was already significant Jewish immigration that came to Argentina at the end of the 19th century. So we are talking that there was a continuous influx of Jewish people coming from Europe, basically, since the end of, the 1890s and 1880s, 1890s. But it continued until the beginning of the war. My grandfather actually, he was the first who came. He did it in 1932, and for what I remember, my father told me that was typical. The procedure was typical. First, the father of the family, the head of the family, went to the place which would be the future place to be, in this case Argentina, to establish himself, to see how successful the future life could be, and then they would send the money back to Poland for the payment of the tickets that at some point weren't, of course, air tickets. They were boat tickets, and the rest of the family would come to in this case to Argentina. And this is exactly what happened. My grandfather Idel, he came in 1932, and 2 years later, in 1934, my father came with my aunt Malka and my grandma Gitel, and they rejoined in Buenos Aires, and they went to live to a city that's to the south, but it's part of the greater Buenos Aires area called Lanús, where by the way there was, and I think that there's still Jewish community, but there was a significant Jewish community there at that point. So again, the reasons are or were the need to have a better future, and at the same time protect the families from the threats that were happening and that were about to happen later. Imagine that my father came here only 5 years before the beginning of the war, and he did come back once to the place. It was after my mother's death. I think it was in 1990 something. I think, yes, it was definitely 1995 or 1996. He came to Warsaw. he visited he visited the city, and then he managed himself to go to Radno. But now the problem is that Radno is in Ukraine right now. After the war, the boundaries moved, and then the town is no longer in Poland. So to come to Ukraine was complicated, but he made it, and he made it with a partner that he had at that time after my mother's death. Both of them struggled to get there in a train, for what I remembered, which was complicated to board and too complicated to get there. But they finally made it. And the only sad part of the story is that he couldn't identify the place where he was born. The town, for what I read after, some years after the beginning of the war, and of course many years after my father's coming, the place was destroyed by the Nazis. So it was rebuilt after, but not necessarily keeping the same aspect. So I remember my father taking himself pictures in different places, trying to see if those were the places or the corners of the town where he was born, or saying, well, maybe this is where my house my house was, or this is where the market was, but he was not sure. So he came back at that point. But in order to have a memory of what my father was talking or telling me about his early life, I always remember him telling me stories before taking me to bed, and telling me stories about the childhood play games, and how he played in the river Pripyat, a river that was frozen in winter. He told me things that for me were like unimaginable, like that if you wanted to go to the bathroom in the night, you had to go outside. That of course it was for me something difficult to understand. And he told me, yes, I had to go outside because we didn't have a bathroom inside our house, and how he played with skiing over the frozen surface of the river. And what he learned Yiddish, Hebrew. He did know some words in Polish as well. I remember himself starting to sing the national anthem, that I can't remember now, the national Polish anthem, because I imagine that he received Polish / Yiddish education. So that's like a big panorama or painting of what he talked to me about his early years in his childhood in Poland.
Mm-hmm. But what he told you about the whole life there, you are talking about that games and being a child, but what their his parents were doing then, what kind of family it was in Poland then?
Well, at that point, my grandfather was a teacher, for what I remember again, and I'm not sure exactly what was my grandmother doing at that point. I'm sure that my grandfather was a teacher, because there are some other references that I found of my grandpa organizing a school at some point. So he was a school teacher. I knew he spoke Polish. I think I'm sure he spoke Polish and Yiddish. As many other Jews, he knew Hebrew, but he didn't speak it fluently as many Jewish people from Eastern Europe because they used it only for liturgical purposes, and with that particular Ashkenazi's accent. You know, he wouldn't speak Hebrew in the way that you would find somebody in Israel speaking today. It was much more with strong German accent or Yiddish accent. So he was a teacher, but again, for what my father told me, and which is also written in my father's book, he had some economical necessities. They weren't so wealthy, and so that was one of the reasons why he decided. When I say he is my grandfather, he decided to go from where he stayed. My father also refers in his book that my grandfather's house was a center where people gathered, the community, the friends, and to sing, to talk about philosophy, to talk about politics. I do remember my grandfather playing mandolin. There was a mandolin somewhere. Unfortunately, I'm not sure exactly where it is today, because I think my aunt kept it, but my aunt died, and I'm not sure if the mandolin is still somewhere in Buenos Aires. But I do remember my grandpa playing the mandolin at some point, and he brought his mandolin to Argentina because it was a way to keep these memories of joy and music. And I imagine that would be a typical moment at home when they lived in Ratno. Typical situation of people coming to have dinner together and singing and talking and laughing about the reality that was not that good at some point, because I think that they were, at the end of the day, I wouldn't say poor, but they were for sure not for sure wealthy people. So that's what they were doing in Poland. After my grandfather's coming to Argentina, I knew my father, his mother, and his sister. They weren't so comfortable in Radno after that, because they had to manage themselves to keep on doing things, and to find a way to live, until my grandfather would send the so-called call. The call would be an amount of money to buy the tickets to go to Argentina to rejoin the whole family. So during those 2 years, until they could come to Argentina, they managed to leave. A fire actually happened, and so they had to move, and they ended the final part of these 2 years, ended living in a friend's house called the Karsh family. So the Karshes actually gave my father, my aunt, and my grandmother a place to be until they were in conditions to come to Argentina. Then when my father came to Argentina, he became something that it's a typical job for Jewish immigrants, that's called cuentenik. Cuentenik is a word difficult to probably describe exactly. It would be a peddler seller, somebody who's actually on the street selling things in installments, and then that was the way he managed to make his life. So because he didn't teach when he came to Argentina, at least for what I remember, he didn't teach at any school. But I do remember when I was very young. I do remember going with my father in the car, in my father's car, to take my grandfather to different clients to collect money. So I remember this image of my father and me going to Lanús. When I say going to, it's because it's a kind of a 40 minutes ride or so. Picking my grandfather up and going to make a kind of a tour through the neighborhood to go knock the doors and collect the monies from the different people that were buying different elements, like home appliances or books or fabrics and all that stuff that they would sell. My grandfather would sell. So that's basically the way of life, if you want, they had in Poland first. For what I know, it's of course through my father's words, and then in the first years when they arrived to Argentina.
And are there any stories about the process of immigration? I mean, the journey to America. How it exactly took?
Well, the process was for my father was going by car from Radno to Kovel. Kovel is a city, let's say a most important town or a city that had a railway connection. Then from Kovel they took a bus, I think, to Warsaw, where they stayed. I remember my father telling me about his surprise when he first saw an elevator, because he was here in Warsaw in a could probably be a department store or something. It was the first time he traveled in an elevator, and then after a couple of days being here doing some paperwork, they went to Gdynia in the Baltic, which my father, by the way, in his book, in a wrong way, he mentioned the North Sea, but it's a Baltic Sea. So he went by train to Gdansk, to Gdynia, and then they took a boat to London, or to Southampton. Actually, he stayed. I remember he told me he stayed for about 6 days in the Immigrants Hotel in London, and then back to Southampton to take the first. Yes, I think it's the first ship to Buenos Aires. And as he mentioned in his book, there were several stops in the journey. I was doing my own research, and I found that it was like he said. I mean, it wasn't, of course, a direct journey to Argentina. I imagine that there could have been some stops in Europe or in some island in the middle of the ocean. But in any case, they had stops in Brazil. He mentioned some stop in Santos, the harbor that's near Sao Paulo, the capital. It's not a capital city, sorry, but it's one of the most important cities in Brazil. Then probably Montevideo, and then Buenos Aires, Argentina. My mother, by the way, she was born in Montevideo, so as well as there were um, journeys to Argentina, there were also journeys to Uruguay and to Brazil, of course. So what he expressed about the first journey was a very moving one. I mean, because for the first in the first place, he was for the first time in front of the sea in Gdynia, and he puts that in his book, like he felt like a big monster that would swallow you, the sea. So for somebody who was in contact with the nature only by the neighboring places where you only have one river, one small river, probably the Pripyat, that frozen on that got what got frozen on winters. So coming and see the sea for the first time was impressive for him. And he mentioned that the boat that took them to London was a kind of a nutshell, so a very small one, and that everybody was sick on board except himself. He said, I didn't actually suffer anything. And the other funny part of the story is that he mentioned that the boats that came from the ships actually that went from London to South America started with AL. And in his case, this steamship was called Alcántara. But I know that because I have a photo of my grandma from my mother's side, she came in a boat called Almanzora. So Alcántara, Almanzora, those were ships belonging to the same company, and the way they could identify that they belonged to the same company was because they started with AL. And he told me that his 10th birthday was on the sea when he was about to get to Buenos Aires 3 days before, because he arrived to Argentina on April 26 in 1934. My father came with his mom and sister. And that's like the way they came. I remember that for me it's interesting that at my age, I mean, yes, being in Argentina, a son of immigrants, now it's not that common. I mean, I'm son of immigrants because my mother was Uruguayan and my father was Polish. So it's interesting even for me to tell that to my friends, and the fact that my father was, when I say, for instance, at school, if you had to put your father's because it's a typical thing, describe your family, where your father and your mother were born. And so I put my mother was born in Uruguay, which is normal because Argentina and Uruguay are close countries. But my father was born in Poland, so everyone was Poland. And then yes, my father was Polish, and then he became an Argentine citizen in 1950 something. And of course, depending on the year you became an Argentine citizen, you would be eligible or not to be to reclaim the Polish citizenship. Actually, my grandmother couldn't make it. We couldn't do it because she made the so-called its naturalization, meaning that you become Argentinian in a period of time that for some reason the Polish authorities were not allowing to give the citizenship. I have it. My father had it. I do, and my sons have as well Polish passports.
Can you tell when you when you regained that citizenship, and can you tell a bit what was the process of doing it?
Yes, well, my to be honest, and because I think it's the only way to be honest, my father was never neither interested nor impulsing himself or myself to be in contact with the Polish nationality or the Polish roots or the Polish heritage. I would say that he was more interested in the Jewish origins, but I think that at some point the fact that he was born in Poland was an accident. Even my my grandparents as well, but with some nuances. For instance, my my grandfather, my father, at the end of the day, he spent only 9 years and almost 10 years of his life in Radno, in Poland. So his connection to the Polish the Polish reality, or Poland as a country, was not that strong. I do think that my grandparents did have a stronger connection to Poland as country, and they did have to be in contact with non-Jewish population or the non-Jewish community in their day-to-day activities. Although my grandpa, as I said before, he was a teacher at a Hebrew school, for sure, or Yiddish school. But for what I remember and for what I know because of my father, my my grandfather and my grandmother, they spoke Yiddish and Polish. Yiddish and Polish. And again, I knew that my father could speak some words in Polish, but he didn't remember them much of them. I remember having them, having him saying some few words in Polish because I wanted him to tell something in Polish, and he said "Reszcie Polish ta Polska," like Republic of Poland, and started to sing the anthem, and as I said before.
But excuse me, so you as a child, you were quite interested, I mean, in that. It was something that's
yes,
intriguing for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yes, and it was because first of all because I was curious for nature. I have no sister or brother, so I'm the only child of my mother and my father, and it was something exotic, if you want, the fact that my father was born in Poland. Again, when you see the map, it's like too far away, it's like, but we never felt, or I myself never felt connected to Poland, neither to the country nor to the language. But I must admit that when I first landed in Warsaw, that was 2 years ago, I instantly started to cry. And still in the plane, I remember couldn't stop crying, because at some point, I was 58 at that point, so 58 years after. For the first time in my life, I mean, in 58 years, I've never been to Poland. At some point, I felt something like, oh, I am here because of coincidences, beautiful coincidences of life, that I am here, and I'm back in the in the country where my father was born, and that was like a trigger, you know, was like uncovering some hidden part of my past. And I thought that because of something, my father was born in Poland as well, no? Because I do remember this, that I was so intrigued in how his early life was, and I asked him, where is our surname coming from? What does Konischer means? What does Konischer mean? And he said, I'm not sure, but he told me two things, or three things. One is that he thinks that he thinked that the origin of the name could either be from a town near Radno called Koniszcz or Konin or something like that. So Koniszczar would be the person coming from that town. Second would be that koń, as you know, in Polish means horse. So he said probably there was some member of our family who was in relation with horses. I thought that maybe that could be an explanation, because he told me that many of the last names of Polish / Jewish families were related to their daily jobs. So Schmuckler, whatever you know, that's it's a lot of examples that are related to jobs or to links to activities or to elements in nature. For instance, when I started to learn Polish, that's something that happens 2 years ago. One of the first things that came to my attention was the fact that my mother's last name, which is Bursztyn, is a very famous precious or semi-precious stone here in Poland. So I didn't know that. I know that Stein, whatever it ends in Stein, means some stone.
Przepraszam, musimy wstawić tutaj parę rzeczy. Później.
A można później, bo teraz mamy wywiad.
Sorry?
Przepraszam.
He's gone. He's locking us. Locking the door. So we are gonna be here for the rest of the day.
But why?
No, he's not locking.
A dlaczego Państwo to chcą tu wstawić?
Taki mamy rozkaz.
Aha, dobrze. To ja to wstawię, jak skończymy nagranie. Nie ma problemu, tak. Aha.
Ale tu.
Dobrze, ja wstawię, nie ma problemu. Dobrze, tak.
So that, and the third interesting thing about the last name of our family, some relatives from my grandfather went to America, but to North America, and when they arrived in North America, they changed their name because, again, in my mind, it was because of the fact that it's a typical North American thing, the fact that you make things easier or more practical. So they changed from Koniszczer to Kaner, which is Kaner. By the way, I met one of them in a few years ago before the couple died in New York. And it was interesting. I mean, but we didn't have a lot of things to talk, you know. But it was funny to find finally in person the persons who my father thought that they changed their name. Because one important thing to mention is that for me it was not that easy to learn how to write my own last name, because it's so complicated. I mean, it's a lot of
it's so Polish. I would say.
it's super Polish. Yes, super Polish. But in a Spanish-speaking country, it sounds like complicated. I have a collection of, at some point after having becoming what I'm doing right now, I had to travel a lot. So I do travel a lot in the region, basically in Latin America. And at some point, I remember having gone to Chile many times, where the same car company was expecting me with a sign in their hands. And I have a collection of different versions of my last name, because it's very difficult to write. I mean, it's not easy. So I have like 20 different ways to write Conischer in Spanish. And but I was going to say something about the process. You asked me about the process. So that whole process of coming into Argentina was like the whole journey was about a month, from Radno to Buenos Aires.
But I was also asking you about the process of gaining
residence, the Polish.
The journey in the opposite way.
The journey in the opposite way. Yeah, right. Yeah, well, again, as I said, because I'm sorry, when we say in Spanish, we go through branches. Nos vamos por las ramas. No, a friend of mine told me at some point back to probably, yes, 2000, yeah, it was like in 2000, around 2000, 2001, that Poland was about to be part of the European Union. At that point, I think it was still the European Community. So, and I said, well, it's interesting. Why? Because he told me, my father was also born in Poland, and if you can prove that you are descendant of Polish born people, then you can get European residency or citizenship. And I said, well, why would that be of interest? And he said, well, for you, for traveling, for your children, maybe in the future, it's important, to have another citizenship. So he said, I will give you the contact data of the person who is managing these, because it's not easy, of course, understanding the language, basically, because it must be filled. All the forms must be filled in Polish. So he put me in contact with this woman called Marta Brzezewska, and I started, the process. Good luck was that I had many of the paper in good way, well kept, and my father had that. When I say it's my father actually who started doing that. He provided me with all the documentation, and so we started a very slow process. I mean, we weren't in a hurry at all. The good coincidence is that when my father got 80, that very week he received the letter of citizenship. However, he never got the passport, because that's a second process. But with the that must have a name in Polish that I can remember now. That letter of citizenship, which is like the declaration that you are a citizen, a Polish citizen. Then you can start the procedure as in line of descendants. Then I could do that, and after that, my children could do it. I have 2 boys, and only after having that, I could start the passport procedure. But in any case, I always managed that through this person who was in contact with the Polish embassy in Argentina. And at some point, I did have to go to the embassy but it was like once or so. And they got me. They were fine with us, you know, with me first, and then with my children. If when I had to do the second, the new their passports as well. So we signed some papers and we had to wait like an year or so after we finally received. First, we received this green green papers with the declaration or the authorization to start the second part of the process, which is the passport, and then we did it. So it was that was it. I mean, they weren't interested a lot in getting me or my kids in more in contact with the Polish reality or the Polish embassy. Now I'm doing that on my by my intention. I'm getting in contact with the embassy, and as I mentioned, when I'm back to Buenos Aires, I already know that the ambassador is going to have a meeting to give them some copies of the book in Polish.
And you said that you started to learn Polish. Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, well, that's another story that has to be a lot with myself. I always say that I'm a graphic designer, so I must be a visual person, but I'm also a person of letters. I love languages. If I had time, I would be learning all kind of languages. I speak Spanish, of course, that's my mother language. I've learned some Hebrew, but not at school, because my education was only in the first year of the kindergarten, the years before going to the primary school. I went to a Jewish school, but that's it. I mean, I don't have the typical education that somebody who could be in a Jewish school could have. So all I know from the Jewish history or the Bible or the religion that actually came from my dad, or my grandpa taught Yiddish to me, but I can't speak Yiddish. I understand a few words. I remember my father saying "Ich hab schon gegessen," for instance, which is I finished to eat. Every time he finished eating, said "Ich hab schon gegessen." It sounded like funny the way the Yiddish sounds in a mouth, or a few words. And I will tell you in a minute a coincidence that I found after that. But it started that I've learned, for instance, I do speak English, as you see, not so fluently, but I do. And I've never gone to an English school. Actually, it's something that I've learned at school, at the public school. But then it's all self-taught. I speak somehow French, but that's because I love languages again, and I had to do a trip to France, and then I said, well, I could start learning French after having had a couple of years of French at the secondary school, but that's not enough. And so I've learned, and I started to speak more fluently. I had to work with French companies then a few years later, and then I made good use of my knowledge of French. But when I faced the possibility to visit Poland for the first time, that was 2 years ago, then I said, well, maybe it's a good occasion to at least have some basic knowledge of Polish. And that was because of a very small thing that had to be if I have a Polish passport and I'm about to be in front of a Polish customs officer, how would I say to that person that I have a Polish passport? I don't even know to say hello. You know, so it's a kind of a shameful thing for me. So I said, well, let's see how difficult it could be, because I had my own experience of having learned French not so long ago. So I went, we went by actually, passing through in front of the so-called the Polish house in Buenos Aires, not far from where I live. And then I saw a sign saying Polish courses, and I just picked a number of somebody, Maria, that's my first Polish teacher. And so I started learning Polish. The first thing that Maria told me was, first of all, Gustavo, do you know that Polish is considered one of the 5 more difficult languages to learn in the world? And I said no, but
it's very good.
It's a good way to start.
Yeah.
It's very encouraging.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a challenge. And when I say to her that I've learned Latin at school, I don't speak Latin. Nobody does, actually, but except Pope, I hope. But the declinations of the words, that's something that when you have it from Latin, as I do, it's easier to understand. Dopełniać, nadzielnik, wiernik, mianownik, and then I've started, but unfortunately I can't maintain a conversation yet. But I'm in the way too. And again, I find in the learning of the Polish language some interesting connections to my past, because of the fact that I always remember that my grandparents talked in Polish as well as in Yiddish, and my father at some point spoke Polish, not so fluently because he was very young when he came to Argentina, as I said, so he had to learn Spanish. By the way, if you listened to some of my father relatives, either cousins or aunts or uncles, they spoke Spanish with a super strong Jewish Eastern European accent, you know, like very strong. My father didn't have any accent. My aunt Malka, a little bit of accent. But for me, again, coming back to the question, learning Polish is a way to be connected with my roots. Either they are Jewish or not necessarily linked to the Polish national elements or symbols. But as in general terms, I think that it's a way to activate your mind as well, to challenge yourself all the time. And the funny thing that I was going to mention is that I also found some interesting links with my family, with my mother, and with my father. My parents, when, as probably it's typical in many homes, when my parents didn't want me to know about something they want to talk in private, they spoke themselves. They spoke among themselves in Yiddish. Yiddish was the mother language for my father, not necessarily for my mother, but my mother's parents, that's my grandparents, they did speak Yiddish, and they also spoke, as my other grandparents, they spoke Spanish with a strong accent. Okay, and I remember them talking in Yiddish. So the few words that I can identify in Yiddish from my childhood I can remember some of them, and I can understand very vaguely a conversation in Yiddish. But one interesting thing is that, as you may know, Yiddish is fed by different sources, mainly German, but also Polish. So when I started learning Polish, I found some words that actually were present in my father and mother's, so my parents' conversations, that actually belong to the Polish language. One typical word that I remember is przystojny. Przystojny, which means handsome in Polish. I remember my mother, when I had to go to school or to a party or to go out, she ended to just put her hands on my clothes to say, okay, you are przystojny, saying you are przystojny. And then when I first listened to the word przystojny in my Polish classes, it was like a flashback, an immediate flashback, which is so strong that's something that it's like discovering a hidden part of your memory in a minute, in a second. So it was like, wow. So that another interesting reason why I would love to continue learning Polish, because it's a way to keep on discovering things of my own past, of my own family in the past.
And what about your mom? You said that your mom also she was born in America, I understand, South America, but she was a child of immigrants from Europe.
Exactly.
And was she also somehow, I don't know, connected to Europe through her parents?
No, well, my mother was born in Uruguay, in Montevideo. My mother's side grandparents, my grandfather name, I remember him because with one of my cousins we laughed at how it sounded. His name was Jutko Binem Busztyn. Jutko Binem was a Jewish / Polish name, but we called him Il, as well as my father's father. But in Spanish we call them Ignacio. Ignacio it's an invented name. I mean, it's a real name in Spanish, but it doesn't necessarily mean Il in Spanish. He was called Ignacio. And Berta, my grandmother from my mother's side, Berta is the Spanish version of Braja, but we called her Bronche. So she was Bronche and Il, my grandparents from my mother's side. Bronche, and this is something that it's super close to me. My favorite, because one important thing to mention, my grandparents from my father's side, they lived not in the same city, but in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. That's, as I said, 40-45 minutes from home. So we visited them almost every Shabbat, every Friday night. In the case of my mother's parents, they lived in Montevideo. Montevideo is 250 kilometers away, but it's another country, and so you cannot just take a car. Now you can, but now you can, but you have to do like a 6-hour or 7 hours trip by car. Normally you would take a 25 minutes plane. That's the most common way to get there, or a 2.5 hours ferry boat ride, or other combinations that you can do when you go to Uruguay. there's a lot of connection, by the way, between Argentina and Uruguay. We share a lot of culture, the same, very similar past, and so on. But for me, going to Montevideo, because of the fact that my mother's parents, they had more family in Uruguay than the one my father parents had in Buenos Aires. So in Buenos Aires, I felt somehow alone. I remember that I have no brother, no sister. So for me, I mean, going to Montevideo was a party, was a joy. I was expecting very strongly going every summer to Montevideo, and that was the plan. That was my plan since I was born until I was 18. I spent all my summers in Uruguay, basically Montevideo, living in my grandparents' house. And I did have a lot of, I do still have a lot of cousins and relatives and siblings to be connected with, etc. All of them in Uruguay, where, by the way, that could be another story. There was and there is still a strong but small Jewish community coming basically from Eastern Europe as well. But they, my mother, as I said, she wasn't. She didn't have a Jewish education, for what I remember, but she spoke Yiddish, not as a mother language, but she spoke Yiddish very fluently. I remember her talking in Yiddish. I remember her talking in Yiddish, of course, with her parents. That's a way she used to be connected with them, and with my father, as I said, when they had to talk something that they didn't want me to understand. But I have gone many times in my life when I was young to Montevideo, either for Pesach or for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So in the particular case of Rosh Hashanah, I also remember doing some kind of shul tour. I mean, you would go to different synagogues with my cousins, because it was part of the nature of the celebration. Must be also relevant to say, in a very open society as the Uruguayan society is. I would say it's even more laicist and open in Uruguay than in Argentina. I'm not talking about anti-Semitism or reaction toward Judaism. It's simply as the fact that they are like more liberal, more open. The country was always considering the separation between the church and the state as something normal, a lot of years before we did that in Argentina. So it was like more open, going to celebrations and being together, Jews and non-Jews, and so for me was a joy in many senses. Not only because of the fact that I was in contact with my cousins, they had my age, but also because of the fact that living your Judaism was something totally open and funny. I wouldn't do a shul tour, in a synagogue tour in Buenos Aires, but I did do it in Montevideo every time I went for the celebrations for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur.
So you grew up in like Ashkenazi tradition, I understand.
Yes, all of them Ashkenazi.
And in your home, you are talking. We have Pesach today and Rosh Hashanah and so on. Did you were there anything special that you know that it comes from parts of the tradition that comes especially from Europe? It's typical.
Yes, well,
or I don't know, the food dishes or.
yes, the both my my both my my two grandmas were very good cooks. And I was about to say something real in relation with my grandmother's, with my mother's mother, my grandma from my mother's side. That my favorite meal was smetana, potato with potato mashed potato with smetana. That's the way she said smetana. Smetana, that would be the Yiddish version of smetana. And I still remember, and it's amazing because it's the same thing that happened with the smell of the book. I still remember the taste of and the contrast between the mashed heat potato, and the way she took the sour cream, which is smetana, that they did have in Uruguay, made by the Uruguayan national company called Conaprole, and we didn't have that in Argentina. So that was another interesting part of me flying, going to Uruguay, because I was expecting that delicious meal that my grandma prepared. And I remember her tapping on the back of the bottle. It's a bottle that you have to tap a lot of times to make the sour cream coming over the mashed potatoes, and the flavor and the contrast between the coldness of the sour cream, the smetana, and the potatoes is something that I still remember. I still remember that when I finally mixed it, it's super cozy. I mean, that memory is something that. But as they say also, if you talk to somebody from the Sephardi world, he or she would say, you Ashkenazis, the only thing that you can cook is potato. Because it's funny, but it's typical from Eastern Europe. I mean, it's potato plus something. So, mieszkanka is it in Polish? And potato is... Ziemniak, nasz mieszkan. Ziemniak, ken. Tak, and it's ziemniak zmetany, that would be. And the other thing that I remember from my either grandmother's house in Montevideo or grandmother's house in Lanús in Argentina is borscht, or barsh, but called in Yiddish borscht. Always czerwone barsh. I didn't like it at all. My father loved it. He loved either hot or cold. He loved it. I mean, you could see him taking the plate and just sipping it from in one shot. He loved it. I didn't. Now I'm in a good relationship with beetroots, but not before. And I also remember Essefleisch. Essefleisch is another typical meal coming from the Eastern Europe, which is I don't know how to describe it. Essefleisch, but it's something with flesh, with the meat. And of course, I do have a strong memory of my my childhood Pesach Sedrim Shel Pesach, and that's the reason why I keep this Haggadah. It's the only thing I would love to keep, because it reminds me to my my sedarim at my grandfather's house, and including the famous part where kids have to go and look for, and I can't remember, aficamon,
Yeah.
the aficamon, is it?
Yes. But
They hide. They had one part of the matzah. They were, I mean, my grandparents from the my father's side, they were somehow more traditional and respectful for traditions than my grandparents from my mother's side. It doesn't mean that they weren't forgetting or abandoning their Jewish practices, but for what I remember, my grandpa, who was more distant, my grandpa, my father's father, was somehow more distant to me than my other grandparents, but he was they respected the Jewish traditions more. And for instance, Seder in Pesach, like the one that we are going to have today, they did it. I mean, they did it. They followed the steps. I still remember my father having this, trying to pretend that I think that the glass for Eliyahu Hanavi. Do you know the part of the story that there is a glass that is supposedly to be drunk by Prophet Eliyahu?
Yeah.
So I still remember that part of the Seder where he said, "Okay, Eliyahu Hanavi is coming. Open the door." So he opened the door, and supposedly Eliyahu Hanavi was there. So I was intensively looking at the glass, and my father probably was moving the table at the same time, and he said, "Look how it's the wine is moving because it's Eliyahu Hanavi who is right now." By the way, Eliyahu Hanavi, it's in Hebrew, but he said Eliyahu Hanuvi. Eliyahu Hanuvi is Eliyahu Hanavi in Yiddish. Mm-hmm. So I had this memory of Eliyahu Hanuvi. Eliyahu Hanuvi is coming.
So yeah, that's interesting, and yeah, that's Haggadah that you showed us. It's really something. I understand absolutely that you want to keep it. It's something very personal and precious.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you if there are any kind of any relatives stayed in Europe. You were any kind of relatives that were in Europe?
No.
If everybody came to more or less to
or died.
the ocean.
Or died. Mm-hmm. Because what I did know is that not all of my grandma's and my grandpa's direct relatives flew or escaped, and that's the sad part of the story, is that I don't really have the records or the way to know exactly, but I do know that some of them were finally either kept or killed. The only thing is that I don't know if I have relatives that have been killed in some concentration camp, but probably I do. But I don't know exactly. But I do know that some of them could never escape if they stayed here after the beginning of the war. And besides that, I know from my father's side, definitely not, because all I know from them is that they either escaped or stayed, and if they stayed, they were killed or they died. From my mother's side, I knew that I had some relative in Belgium, but that's it, no more.
And you said that your father, he was kind of merchant in Brazil?
No.
What was his occupation?
No. My father. We're about to finish now.
think so. Like, it depends on you, but yeah.
No, I think that
It's
maybe
like
they
quarter
will.
past one.
Wow, a lot of time. Um, no, my grandpa. He, as I said, he worked as he more than worked. I would say that he had an occupation that was this one that I called before the Quentenic.
Mm-hmm.
Quentenic meaning some, I know exactly the root of the word, but it's a peddler, a seller, door-to-door salesman.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. My father studied accountant, so he was a public accountant in Argentina, and he succeeded somehow. We never had the, super high level, economically speaking, standard of life, meaning that we had a good middle class, which is typical in Argentina. I always had what I wanted to have, but we never, had important trips in the past or big houses or more than just one car. I mean, that's it. But that was my father as a kind of a self-made man, if you want. But he, professionally talking, he succeeded at the point that he was president of the um, professional council of accountants in his in the place where he was. It's not just Buenos Aires; it's another city in the greater Buenos Aires area. It's called San Martin. He was a president of the professional committee. So he loved his work. He did it in a very good way. He he had a lot of clients that were actually small companies, basically that. um, and and my mother never. I mean, she worked in a drugstore and pharmacy before getting married to my father in Montevideo. But when he went to Buenos Aires, she didn't. When she went to Buenos Aires, she didn't work in an official work. I mean, in a work or as a job. She was at home always. And my father, as I said, he worked there. And my grandfather, sorry, from my mother's side, he worked in as a plumber, as a plumber, and he also worked in a lamp factory that belonged to my grandfather's brother in Montevideo. So as I remember having gone to accompany my father to help my grandfather to collect money, I also remember having gone to visit my grandfather from my mother's side in Montevideo to see how he worked with bronze and glass and all elements. He was a worker, and my that grandfather was a worker with his hands, dirt hands all the time. But he loved to do, and I still have a music box he did for me when I was a child. I still keep it.
Okay, so I just want to ask you how long you will stay now in Poland, and what are your plans for visit? Because this is how I understand you came yesterday, yeah? This
Yes.
is just the beginning.
It's the beginning. Yes, I'm planning to stay here for a few days more. In the middle, I have to do a business trip, very quick, 2 days, and then we'll rejoin with the rest of the family in Krakow. So we'll be first 3 or 4 days here in Warsaw, and then we'll visit Krakow because I think that's another super interesting city. As my teacher said, Krakow was the king's city, or city of kings in the past, and and yes, I had the chance, as I said, to visit Krakow because it was a coincidence that I had to give to speak at a conference in Krakow 2 years ago, and so I could practice my Polish a little bit more. So that's it, and in general terms, I will still keep on learning Polish. I think it's something that I don't want to lose, what I've already learned, the stage where I'm still, what I still am, because I understand that I'll be back to Poland on a frequent basis, and I like the fact to just to be in connection with. I think that despite all prejudices, one has to be open to connect and reconnect. This opportunity of having this new connection to Poland helped me or allowed me to know people in Argentina that are in relation to rejoining with the Jewish / Polish origins and roots. I've learned that there are some activities in order to do that, led or driven by the Polish embassy in Argentina. As the ambassador already told me, when I come back, I will have another meeting there to give them copies of the Polish translation of the Book of My Father, and also to talk about what my experience is right now. Having rediscovered my roots and having somehow found this connection with Poland in a way that, by the way, I understand Poland wants to be perceived as a more open country, to past and future. Przeszłość and przyszłość.
Yeah, I hope so. I just the last question. What is? Can you tell what is the title of your father's book?
Yes, of course. My father's book was De 0 a 80 años, and in English would be from. I translated it in a way that it's probably not the most loyal way to translate it when I had to translate it to English, which is from 0 to 80 something. Well, it's more understandable, but it would be literally from 0 to 80 and an end period.
More.
Yes, and in Polish, we translated it, and I say we is because the translator suggested me od zera do 80. Yeah, od 0 80. And the reason why he did that is because he fell in love with life, actually, my father. He imagined that he had many instances in his life to suffer at some point, and as well to tell others his story. First of all, the fact that you at a very early age of your life, you leave your country, you leave the place where you lived, you leave your friends at 9, you leave Europe and go to an unknown place, because it is not like today that you can simply go and Google whatever you want. I mean, at that point, knowing where it is, this place called Argentina, in the end of the world, so far, days and days of, just exploring the sea and navigating until getting to some place where they speak a language that I don't know, and so on. So that's one thing. and when he got well, he, as I said in my foreword to the book, he got wide aware. He graduated. He got wide aware again because my mother died 30 years ago, when he married again. So he married 3 times actually, and but I'm his only son. I mean, there's no, he didn't have any other son or daughter. And then I think that when he was finally 80 years old, he found that he was going to live still much more. I wouldn't say much more, but my grandparents from my father's side, they died after having passed 90. So I think my grandpa at 95 and my grandma at 93 or something like that, or the other way around. But in any case, he expected to live more, and as a prediction, he died at 89, when let's say literally 6 months before becoming 90 years old. So that's the reason he put 80 something or 8 and something, because he expected to live more. But he had enough material, enough life lived as to tell his story. I think he wanted to tell the story because he wanted to just have a written testimony, a written way to understand what he was living, and all his journey, and that's it. And on the other hand, as I said, he was thankful to life because he lived with leukemia the last, I would say, from his 70 to when he got 70, they discovered that he got leukemia, but in a way that was not dangerous enough, you know. So he, I can't remember exactly the date, but he was supervised by a very good doctor in Argentina called Santiago Pavlovsky, very famous in oncology. And I remember having been with my father and the doctor, and he said, we don't have to take any risk. We don't have to hurry ourselves up. We would be waiting until some indicators come through or go up after several thresholds. And so he spent 10 years of his life with leukemia without being treated, or only supervised, of course, until a moment when he had to take action. And he got an experimental new way to treat the leukemia for the first time, apparently, in Argentina, and he got successful. So the disease disappeared. But he got then another wave of cancer, who finally killed him in 2013. But he lived his life until the last moment he could, with joy. He was loved by everyone. I mean, Abraham, my father, Abraham, was loved by people who worked with him, people who were his clients, his friends, his relatives, his family, of course. My ex-wife, he considered her a daughter. My sons, both of them loved him. So he really got a super healthy atmosphere around him. He was so so nice, and everybody. If you contact everyone who was at some point in relationship with him, you would find somebody who will only have words of beauty about himself and about his soul. He was so kind, so good with me. He was the best father I could ever have. So it's super touchy and super good feelings. All my memories about my father, they are super nice, super good, super nice.
Thank you so much. Do you want to add something at the end? Anything what you think is important for you to be, also recorded at that moment?
Well, I think that I find interesting the fact that in a particular moment like this that we are living in the world, that I find particularly because of the fact that we are experiencing the situations with this new war that we are facing. I started to find some kind of rise of anti-Semitism in the world. So the only antidote to that is to be strong, to attach oneself strongly to their roots, to one's roots. Meaning that I'm not saying that if I haven't been an active Jew, which is not something that I've been, I'm not ashamed of the fact that I'm a Jew, but it doesn't mean that you have to be an activist, an activist Jew. In our case, in my case at least, I never felt like that. But on the other hand, I think that this is a moment where the potential cancellation of the Jewish communities in the world because of the fact that all that's happening, that it's so confused, and Israel as a state being finger pointed as doing bad things and genocide state and so on. Well, it doesn't imply that you have to look at your own Judaism as something that's connected to war or to crime or to whatever. I mean, it doesn't have necessarily to do with that. So the fact that I'm here in a Jewish museum, remembering my Jewish heritage, my Jewish roots, it's something that it's independent from whatever is happening in the world right now. I mean, it's part of our history. I will still love it. I will always feel myself Jewish. And again, it doesn't, I separate that very clearly. It doesn't have to be with religion. It doesn't have to be, in my view, with if you believe or not in God. That's something that's nothing to do. What I do know is that my memories of my father's life and my mother's as well, my grandparents, all that could be, what you could have as the base of what your past is at the end of the day, your traditions, your ethics, your the way you are formed and you are taught the basic elements on how you proceed in life, in day-to-day life. I mean, if you are a good person, I always have my father's teachings in mind. That's something that I do. And I say, for instance, I always say, well, my father said that, for instance, one thing that he always said, the rights, my rights end when the other person's rights start, where the other person's rights start. So just to say one thing that he said to me, or jokes, or funny comments, or other more serious comments, or ways to see reality. He was an accountant, so he knew a lot about economy. So many things that I still use in my day-to-day life are related to things that I remember himself teaching to me. You know, like organizing. He was very organized. He had a beautiful calligraphy. I am a graphic designer, and I still remember his tables, you know, to organize things that could either be clients' number of figures or just lists of things that were at home, the way he put labels to different drawers where he organized papers and so on. So I keep that respect for ordering and for good good taste, if you want, visually talking about as well. So once more, I think that that's something that you have to, on a personal level, but also at a more, if you want, social level or community level. It's something that it's important for one to keep and to reflect on. That's what I think. It's what I can say. That there is a story. In my case, I'm about to be 60 years old this year, in October. So these are like significant dates. You know, my father would have been 100 years old tomorrow. Myself going to be 60. By the way, it's going to be in a month's time 30 years of my mother's death. So it's like, you know, significant dates as to say, well, what do I want to do now with my past? What do I now want to do with my family teachings? With my father, in this case. With my father's teachings and learnings. And in this case, I said, okay, it's a time for taking this out and not necessarily keeping this as a selfish attitude. I think it's nice to popularize it and to make it more accessible for everyone. So that's what I would say. And again, in a moment of times where there's a lot of uncertainty and, you know, a lot of future unclear visions or path, I think that at some point coming and looking at what was the basic of your education could be a nice antidote or a nice way to face in a healthy way what's coming next. Knowing your past to know yourself for the future would be.